and welcome to our panel, which is all going to be about unlocking investment. But first, we're all going to get a little bit tech savvy, because before I introduce the panel, and indeed myself, I want everyone to participate. We're in the modern day and age, and I want a bit of audience proactivity here, if possible. And the way in which you do that, there are flags, pieces of paper on your seats, but we want you to be able to take part by downloading an app wisembly.com. I'm told it's an amalgamation of wise and assembly, so make your questions wise when you go through it. But you can also use the keyword OECD Blue for our interactive platform. Please start putting in your questions, because I have a monitor here. I can see what questions that are being put forward during the panel debate. We can put them to the panelists at the end of our Q&A, so I really want your audience participation. You can also, though, field questions to the panel via Twitter, asking questions on hashtag OECD Blue as well. Your message will be displayed behind us so everyone can see. But if you don't have a smartphone, do not worry. We will be going round with roving microphones as well. But do start thinking up your questions for the panelists. So as I say, go to the OECD Info app, click on the Connect icon and enter OECD Blue. Or if you're on the web, go to app.wisembly.com/OECD Blue, or tweet hashtag OECD Blue. We're getting very tech savvy here at the OECD today, so I look forward to receiving all your questions. But without further ado, let me introduce this panel that we're about to take part in. My name is Caroline Hyde. I'm from Bloomberg Television. It's an absolute joy to be here today with such a stellar cast of panelists. It's a real honor to be able to be taking part and to discussing what is really at the heart of what the whole OECD Forum is about this year. It's about unlocking investment. This seems to be the key concern, indeed, for promoting growth. And on the panel today, we have we first of all have Eric Labbé to my left. Now, he is Chairman, McKinsey Global Institute. He's going to give us some pearls of wisdom, some really great data that they've been bringing to the fore in terms of how investment has been restrained. We've also then, next to Eric, we have Ronald Cohen, Chair of the G8 Social Impact Investment Task Force. Then we have Hami Koç, Deputy Chief Executive of İşbank Turkey, and we are President of the Capital Markets Association as well, so thank you for joining us. We have Danielle Nui, Chair of the Supervisory Board of the European Central Bank. And next we have another Turkish in our midst, and we have Arda Emmett, President and Investment Support and Promotion Agency of Turkey, or ISBAT for short. And lastly, but by no means least, we have Richard Trumka, of course, President of the TUAC and AFL-CIO. So a wonderful panel board. But the key reason, of course, is to discuss unlocking investment. We know the OECD have put statistics out about it, that in some countries we are still 25% below the pre-crisis levels of investment. Why? Why are we not back to where we should be, in excess of 8 years since the financial crisis? Why is it, as governments are being restrained in terms of austerity, is also private capital being restrained as well? Why has it not managed to step in? I mean, at the moment we are still staring at the brink when it comes to Greece at the moment in every single headline, as the government is unable to promote growth within Greece, as it has to cut its own debt, and clearly the banks are seeing deposits leave. This really puts it into perspective of why investment is so crucial to help foster, to drive growth. The private sector hasn't taken up the slack. Is it supply side? Is it that the banks don't want to lend? Is it that investors aren't willing to put forward the money in terms of putting money to work? Is it also regulation? Is that a blessing or a curse in terms of fostering investment? And indeed, on the demand side of things, are companies preferring to deleverage? Are they preferring to give back money to investors rather than invest it in capital growth? What are the reasons behind this? This is what we're going to debate, how we can improve the situation and indeed foster investment in perhaps the greener side of things, in the inclusive side of things, in the social side of things. So without further ado, I want to bring in Eric Labbé from McKinsey, because you've been putting some thought to this, some data to this, and give us just set the scene for us, if you will. How much is investment being put down how far away from pre-crisis levels are we?
Yes, let's start with, in fact, some facts, as you said. When you look at the global investment, you compare 2007 to today, it has been down by 2 or 3% of GDP in North America, Europe, and Japan. If we just give some details on Europe, you have GDP around 12 trillion. And when you compare 2007 to today in real terms, investment has been down by 300 billion. Roughly 20% down as investment, so 300 billion down for corporate investment, 100 billion down on household investment. And this has been compensated mainly by government consumption, 100 billion, and export, 300 billion. So that's how you get to an same level roughly of GDP, which highlight that right now, with the euro evolution, with also the public debt, you could say that the government consumption or the export may have a limited propensity to increase, and therefore the focus I think we have today on investment, both for corporate, how to get 300 more billion in Europe, or also on household investment, 100 billion, is really the right focus. Now, when you think about why did companies not spend these 300 billion? I think there are two main reasons. One is somehow overcapacity. Following the crisis, a lot of industries have had overcapacity, so they haven't really completed more investment in their productive factors. The second is also risk aversion. After the crisis, always fearing more recession coming up, VW, etc. A lot of companies have been somehow piling cash. If you look at the large companies in Europe, they have moved from 200 or 300 billion in 2007 cash on their asset books to 800 billion. So they have put basically cash aside for further investment that basically have not been fueling the economy so far. Last element I would highlight also is on the global trend, a shift evolution in the mix of the economy. A lot, as I mentioned, capital-intensive industries have been under huge global competition with thinner margin and therefore a stronger focus on how they spend asset, even beyond the overcapacity question. And the mix of Europe, North America, Japan, Korea has been moving to more and more knowledge-intensive industries, which are less capital-intensive. Pharmaceutical, software, technology. So we should also keep that in mind, which is it's not only, I would say, a 5-year view. There is also a long-term view that is shifting the economy, which then would require to accelerate, obviously, the development of the knowledge-intensive industries, maybe at a higher rate than what we are doing today. So in that context, overcapacity, risk aversion, the cash is here. So the question is really, how do we unlock both the demand and the supply, which I'm sure is what we're going to talk about.
So talking of the cash is here, I want to get a feeling of whether the banks are willing to lend and indeed whether they're seeing the capital markets accessed as reticently or as enthusiastically. I want to ask Ilhami Koç, I mean, you are president of the Capital Markets Association of Turkey. Are companies willing to invest at the moment? Are they looking for you to ways to invest? And you yourself at İşbank, are you finding that you yourself want to go out there lending and you just can't, or from the supply side, or is it demand reticence, do you think, at the moment in terms of investment?
I think I'm the only banker in the panel. In Turkey, this year we undertook the presidency of G20, and in this G20 now the main theme is 3I: investment, implementation, and inclusiveness. And this, especially on the investment and inclusiveness side, we discuss the role of banking, and especially the finance and SMEs and innovative young companies. This is actually the main problem we discuss nowadays in the banking side. So in most of the OECD countries, including us in Turkey, finance system is dominated by big commercial banks. This is the situation. So in these countries where finance system is dominated by commercial banks, actually SMEs and the small companies, startups, they have really limited access to finance. The reason is actually on the banking side, especially during the deleveraging periods, just after the crisis, we had a deleveraging period, all developed countries. it is more challenging for SMEs to reach finance. For startups, innovative young companies, it is worse than the typical SMEs because their business is a kind of intangible. They have a lack of collateral. Big banks, commercial banks, they hesitate to finance those kind of small, young, innovative startups. So it means that you can create a very strong banking system. Just after the crisis, actually, most of the developed countries, through their deleveraging, they created the sound banking system. But from the point of this SMEs and innovation and the startups, that is not enough. Strong banking system is not enough. Because banking, the nature of banking, they have systemic risk. Because of that systemic risk, it is more and more regulated, supervised by the regulators. So regulators ask banks to be conservative. So under those conditions, banks, they prefer to allocate very, very small amount of resources of the bank to small and medium size, especially for startups, very, very limited resources.
And
so this is the main problem.
And well, let's ask the person sat to your left, as in, because we've rather strategically placed perhaps the overseer of the bank next to the bank himself. And give us a sense, Ms. Nui, do you agree? Do you feel that the regulation is the problem here?
No, I don't think so. I would like to start by saying a few words about are the banks willing to make loans, and what do the banks need to make loans. They need easy access to funding and easy access to equity. Which means that investors need transparency and confidence in the banking system. That's why before taking over the supervision of the euro area banks, we conducted in 2014 a comprehensive assessment with an asset quality review and a stress test in order to make sure that we provided the needed transparency where there were problems in the balance sheet of the banks, they were repaired, and now the investors can be confident to invest in the banks. Is regulation preventing the banks from lending? I don't think so. First, for at least two reasons, probably more, but let's start with the main ones. First of all, after the crisis, and because of the crisis, we have been moving from a situation where regulation was not addressing properly the risk. After a crisis of the size, the magnitude, with the consequences that it had to be addressed properly. But to make sure that this was not locking investments precisely, there was a long transition period, and we are still under this transition period. And this transition has been more generous in Europe, for example. I supervise European banks that everywhere else. So that's why it's not preventing from the banks from making loans. And I would like to share with you the views of the supervisors that it's very important to have a well-capitalized bank, because this is the regulation on capital, which is most of the time mentioned. Well-capitalized banks are the only ones that are able to provide the economy and society at large with credit and financial services, even during the lower part of the economic cycle, and even under severe stress. And that is important. The economy needs stable funding. When the banks which are not enough capitalized tend to be deeply pro-cyclical in their behavior, they lend excessively in the upper phase of the cycle, hence contribute to the crisis when it comes, and they are too weak to support lending even to high-quality creditors when the crisis starts. So that's why we need to have good regulation, good supervision of the banks, and only the banks well-capitalized are able to do their job, fund the economy.
At the moment, do you feel that the Greek banks are well capitalized?
They are solvent, and I have the opportunity to say it many times during the last days and weeks.
And do you feel that the regulation is therefore helping move the trajectory forward in terms of that particular part of the world?
The regulation is doing what it is supposed to do, get safe and sound banks, well-capitalized banking systems, and there are also measures in transition, partly implemented or not implemented at all for the time being, which are treating the funding, the risk resulting from the funding of the banks, a liquidity coverage ratio for the short term and net funding stable ratio for the longer term, but I will not comment on that.
In terms of the reason, let's take it back a step as to what also has cut off the investment. We were talking about it with Eric, and I know we have views at the end with Richard Schumker as to what at the moment is holding back investment from your perspective in terms of the private market. Do you feel that at the moment you're not seeing the sort of risk-taking that needs to be taken in the right way, or the lending that needs to be taken in terms of the private markets?
Well, OECD countries are suffering from two kinds of investment shortfalls. A shortage of basic private business investment and a shortage of public investment in public goods. Both of these shortfalls are the result of what I call the great mistake. The idea that the combination of bailing out big banks and imposing austerity on the public and the public sector was a good way to recover from the economic crisis that began in 2007. Look, businesses invest because they feel confident they'll have customers for their products and for their services. Austerity, falling wages, and deflation kill that confidence. It's compounded, at least in the United States. Fortune 500 companies right now are spending 91% of their profit dollars on stock buybacks and dividends, leaving only 9% for wages, capital investment, and R&D. Then it's compounded by failing to restructure banks makes it worse, because even if unconventional monetary policy lowers the cost of credit, ailing banks won't loan to businesses to make investments in that environment. It's too risky. At least in the US, the banks are focused on businesses that they will get a much higher return on, like lending to hedge funds, which don't actually give any actual investment. So if you want private investment, you rebuild customer demand by ending austerity, by putting people back to work, and raising wages. Public investment is even more straightforward casualty of austerity. You can't get much simpler than this. If you want investment in public goods, roads, bridges, clean energy, you'll never get it if you wait for private markets. Private markets can't get the revenue out of these projects to pay the returns that they demand. And of course, austerity cuts the legs out from under public investment. The solution is not to pretend that austerity is a good idea and then try to pretend that you can fund public goods with private capital. More pretending, more financialization, and more privatization is not part of the solution, it's part of the problem. And that's not to say, Carolyn, that there aren't innovative ways to finance public projects. Of course there are. Labor movements around the OECD have been involved in a number of such experiments. The US, the AFL-CIO, has helped encourage an allocation of $10 billion in pension capital to job-creating infrastructure investment. But I got to tell you, that type of innovation is insignificant in relationship to the global economy's need for trillions of dollars in public investment. So the urgency in the face of mass unemployment, climate change, and our deteriorating infrastructure is just insignificant. This is a problem that's not going to get solved until we recognize that we have made a great mistake and we move away from austerity and start using public investment to stimulate economies.
So a big mistake. I want to go to the audience now because we are going to run a poll today about feeling what's lying behind some of this lack of investment at the moment. And I wanted to ask, we've been talking a little bit about regulation there. From your perspective in the audience, is regulation currently a blessing or a curse? At the moment, is current regulation going to help unlock future investment? As indeed we were hearing from Danielle Nui, she's building banking regulation that she feels will help in terms, it doesn't disincentivize banks to lend. Do you feel that current regulation does help unlock future investment? Yes, you think it will help? 1 or 2, no, you do not believe it will. So please do poll now. It's going to be an interactive poll, and we're going to work out as to whether or not it is indeed going to give us our responses in a moment. But before we get the response to that poll, let me turn to, we were just talking about hearing that austerity, it was felt, was the problem. As an investor in your, now, Sir Ronald Cohen, you're what is called the father of British venture capital. You were a man whose life was spent in investing. Do you think that austerity is the problem at the moment, and you're not going to be able to get infrastructure investment in the current state of affairs?
Thank you, Caroline. I'd like to extend the conversation to take in a few other dimensions. I agree with almost everything that's been said, but you have to add to the current economic challenges that we face all of the social challenges that pre-existed the crisis and have been exacerbated by it. And I'll just give one example. When Janet Yellen spoke in Chicago about a year ago, she brought out the fact that in 1965, 98% of able-bodied men were in employment, and today 91% are. And the main reason was prisons. Prisons. People go into prison, larger numbers went into prison in the United States, and when they left prison, they couldn't get jobs. Every crisis creates new mechanisms to try to solve it. When there was high unemployment in the early 70s, in the UK in particular, venture capital came in and people thought, well, how can young people leading small businesses create jobs? The reality is, if you look at the United States, 60 million jobs were lost by smokestack industries, and something like 70 million jobs were created by new industries, which hadn't existed before. And so I think the world is going through the realization now that public expenditure and governments cannot do everything. Social issues can no longer be addressed in the way that we are addressing them. And impact investment basically says, if you want to address social issues, given the constraints that we have on expenditure by governments, you've got to harness the forces of entrepreneurship, innovation, and capital. The same forces that brought about the technological revolution that has transformed our lives have to be harnessed to transform the lives of those who are left behind. Because if you're facing social issues like high youth unemployment, which we face across the world, if you're facing issues like an elderly population and the prospect of the aging poor, government isn't going to be able to deal with it. Government cannot tax more and spend more. We need a revolution. We need innovation in the way we tackle these issues. And so, in order to connect social entrepreneurs to the capital markets, impact investment has come along. And it, in my view, will revolutionize investment in this century. Historically, you could argue that at the time of Adam Smith and before, and right through to the 19th century, investors thought about financial return. In the 20th century, they began to think of risk and return and measure both. Today, we're already measuring risk, return, and impact. And we are tying the achievement of impact to a financial return. An improvement in the number of prisoners who go back to jail can lead to a 7% uncorrelated return on a social impact bond. There are 45 social impact bonds across the world. They deal with homelessness, adoption, foster parentage, unemployed youth. There are social impact bonds for dropout rates from school in Rajasthan for girls. There are diabetes prevention social impact bonds on the way, stroke prevention. This new way of setting impact goals as well as financial goals and measuring the achievement of both is, in my view, going to transform capital markets.
So we're starting to already move on to how we help the situation, alleviate the situation. Let's ask someone whose job is to bring inward investment. Do you speak to us about, Adaomet, what are you seeing in terms of appetite to invest at the moment, and what novel ways are you trying to entice that in, to grow that in face of potentially seeing governments having to retrench in terms of their spending?
As it has been discussed, of course, the situation is not very easy, especially and since the demand for the investment is not very high at the moment. And also I'm speaking not maybe in the name of the Turkish Investment Agency, but also at the same time automatically became the chairman of also the World Association of Investment Promotion Agencies, which represents more than 180 investment promotion agencies all over the world, both nationally and regionally. So when we discuss among our peers, we also see the situation is not getting easier especially after the crisis for the developing countries. But I can say that for Turkey, especially after we had a huge hit just after the crisis in 2009, the amount of foreign direct investments, which was around 20 billion US dollars, suddenly dropped to 8 billion US dollars. But now we can say there has been a moderate recovery. We are around 13 billion US dollar now, and we stabilized on that. But of course, we believe the potential is much higher, but still the global risks are continuing. This is more or less the same case, especially for the developing economies when we look at our peers too. And when we look at the reasons, as it has been also discussed, especially as a vicious circle, if we look at it, we can see that the main problem is the lack of finance, which is especially disturbing the SMEs and decreasing the economic activity on that side. And also, on the other hand, there is the weak aggregate demand, especially on the aggregate demand side. All our colleagues here told about especially the public expenditures. It can be made in a more sophisticated way, especially in the areas like education, green energy, modernizing the transportation, which is we are especially trying to do in Turkey at the moment. And especially we are investing in education in very huge amounts. If you know the region especially and the regional politics, you can imagine that the majority of the countries in the region, the lion's share for the budget is going to defense. But for Turkey, for the last 10 years, it's now the national education especially. Then it comes to healthcare. I think it's the 4th or 5th, it comes to defense now. So I think all the countries are now realizing the fact that they have to invest in these areas rather than the conventional areas. And we believe by that side, not only by expanding in public the projects, but making it in a more sophisticated way, maybe the economic situation can be getting better, and the demand for investors to invest in different countries also increase in line with that.
So it's a question of confidence. I want to take it back to the poll that we just had, the Assembly poll. We now can be able to get a response to actually whether indeed we are seeing that regulation is going to unlock. It seems that actually 80%, an out-and-out resounding majority, feel that regulation as it stands will not help unlock future investment. I want to go straight to Daniel Nui on this. Are you seeing signs of life in terms of the banks that you're looking at, that you're supervising? Do you feel that at the moment we're being all too impatient and perhaps we are going to start to see an upturn?
Well, indeed, it takes some time because precisely the transition was gradual in Europe. The certain banks still have a legacy portfolio and still have some cleaning of their balance sheet to do. But because this debate has been focused on SMEs, I would like to remind you that in the European regulation, we have a special SME factor to help the funding of these SMEs. It means that the co-legislators in the preparation of the CRD4 and the regulation implementing Basel III have made some kind of deviation vis-à-vis international standard to make sure that the increase in capital requirement was offset for SMEs. So for the time being, there is no more capital requirement for the SMEs than before the crisis. So I think that's an important element, and the supervisors are supporting it because we have this special situation in Europe where the funding of the economy is mostly done through the banks. It's about 80% through the bank, 20% through the markets, when it works the other way around in the US, for example. So it was important to protect the economy, and this has been done. And there is also something that we are trying to do, which is get the securitization market working again after the crisis. The ECB has been very much involved in promoting a simple, high-quality, transparent securitization, in particular to support the SMEs, but not only the SMEs. Securitization can play a key role for the banking industry, and it could have direct implications for SME financing. And for the banks, on top of improving their funding capacity, it can achieve risk transfer. It can help banks to diversify their financing sources to a wide array of creditors, thanks to the being securitization sponsors, for example, thanks to the tranching that is used in securitization, so they can reach different creditors, investors with different risk return preferences, different investment horizons, and this is really what is missing, in our view, to help the funding of the economy, and in particular SMEs. It's an important instrument for getting funding to those firms.
Let's ask the president of the Capital Markets Association to Turkey as to whether the securitization is the answer. Is it taking off? And you said, as a banker yourself, that SME lending to the SME was the problem.
First of all, I agree with the result of the panels, this poll, by the way. Generally, please forgive me, generally regulators, they prefer to regulate the market, let's say, big, strong banks. Because if you create those kind of too big to fail banks, it is easier for regulators, governments to control the finance system, to control to avoid any systemic risk. But it is the right system for the growth of the economies, growth of the countries. Our solution is actually market-based finance. From the big, strong commercial banks' perspective, it is a kind of top-down approach. Our solution is a kind of a bottom-up approach. It should be market-based finance. I mean, if you accept market-based finance, we believe that it will allocate resources in accordance with their risk capacity. It is a better way to finance, especially SMEs, young, innovative companies, startups. I remember, for example, during the crisis, when in Europe, Germany announced that. First reaction was the Germany at that time. They prohibited CDS and short selling. If you can prohibit those kind of typical market-based tools, how can you create such an environment, such an ecosystem to support and finance small and innovative young companies?
Eric, I want to ask quickly you, because you have some findings from your report. How? Is it an agreement that we need lighter regulation? Is that the answer?
I think we need to, there is no silver bullet in my mind, and that's always the issue, is everybody is trying to say there is one element, and it's, as usual, as any living organism, it's more complex. So So somehow the point I would make on the table is to say that at the same time, you need to move on the supply and the demand. We need to get out of the stalemate of is it one or the other. And you need to get both more competitiveness for countries. At the same time, you need to boost the demand. And the issue, in particular, if I look at Europe, is a lot of the competitiveness levers are in countries. A lot of the demand levers are at the European level. And that's this imbalance which is difficult to manage. Because in the middle, there is a trust somewhere between the European together doing European measures and saying, you know, do I trust every country to move on the competitiveness? Just to give maybe an example or some numbers on that, when you look at all the elements, you know, when you talk about competitiveness, it's really innovation, education, infrastructure, the single market. You know, I think many levers have been identified. If you push all of them in all countries in Europe, you can get to a 2 to 3% growth. And you could say, you know, it's theoretical. Yes and no, because at the same time, you've always found a best practice in Europe. On every dimension of competitiveness, there is a European country that is best practice in the world. So one of the elements is, how do countries, quote unquote, learn from each other to apply or learn? You can't always apply by itself, but to learn from the neighbors and say, you know, how do I improve my labor flexibility market or labor market flexibility? How do I create innovation clusters and so on? But here, there is potential to boost to 2 to 3% growth, which I think would be great. The issue here is to do that, you need some financing. Investing in infrastructure, investing in education, allowing the transition of people from, you know, one industry to another. And when you compute, it's 2 to 4% of GDP. So this is where the demand side plays. And you need some demand, either direct demand to support investment, like infrastructure, or demand also to support consumer investment. And here, I would say you have 2 or 3 levers. We talked about one, which was, you know, how do we get more money to the SMEs? I remind us that for the big companies, they have cash. So it's not a question of financing for big companies. It's more a question of, do they have consumers that are buying their products? And here somehow you have 2 streams of things to look at. One would be to go the higher way and say we need more integration, which I think in the long term, you know, obviously Europe is a huge continent. How do we get more integration, economic, fiscal integration? How do we get more cyclicality and so on? This is going to be a long road, but that's something that needs to be explored to be able to do investment beyond the fiscal compact we have today. But on the other hand, there are maybe a few things you can do today in the current construct. And let me give you 3 examples quickly. One would be, you know, accounting rules on infrastructure investments. You know, in companies, you can depreciate over 20, 30 years. On government in Europe, it's not exactly the case. So can we do that? Can we evolve the accounting rules to be able to, you know, basically spend more, but under the current rules by adapting the accounting rules? That would be one. A second would be to basically boost, you know, the consumption. We know that the low-wage earners consume more, or propensity to consume is higher than the high-wage earners or capital earners. Can we shift a bit the taxation, you know, decrease the wages, tax wages on labor, increase a bit? Again, in a very thorough way and smart way, but to boost by a few $1 billion or euros the spending. And the third one is the European population is aging. And how do we unlock the silver economy? There are also, you know, people over 55 have, you know, 60% of the wealth. How do we get this wealth as consumption, either by providing more services? How do we transfer to the young generation, et cetera, et cetera? So as you can see, there are no one silver bullet, but at the same time, let's boost competitiveness and increase demand. And in demand, let's look at some short-term and some long-term transformation.
And there are a lot of European views from there. I want to get well, Eurozone opinions as well. Let's talk about Turkey and the US. First of all, Richard Trumka, is there any country you look at for how you think could be helping to unleash more investment in the United States as you feel it? You were saying that you need more in terms of infrastructure investment. Any countries you look to?
Well, so much to say and so little time to respond. I have something to say to all of my colleagues beforehand, and I'll try to wrap it into one answer. First of all, to my colleague from the bank, the lack of regulation led to the crisis. Unless you have a regulatory framework, the market will eat itself. And that's proven to be. And so we need a regulatory framework that's strong, that makes sure that the banks are well capitalized so that they can function. We can have confidence in them.
So Richard, in response to the poll where we had 80% people saying that regulation won't unlock investment, do you disagree? Do you think as it stands the regulatory framework will?
You didn't ask them the question, would regulation have prevented the crisis if properly done? Because we had deregulated beyond the point where we needed to be. That's what caused the crisis. Those banks were deregulated. They had no framework to operate in, and it was a free-for-all. And it resulted in a crisis that almost brought the entire system down. Now, my friend here talked about aggregate demand, and I think that's right. Why do we have an aggregate demand problem? Because wages in the world have been stagnated for 30 years. Why have they been stagnated for 30 years? Well, there's been a continuous attack on labor institutions and the institution of collective bargaining, which helped that wealth get from the top, spread all the way down to the bottom, including the youth. And to my other friend that said there's a social dimension, there absolutely is. If you look in the United States, we first privatized prisons. When we privatized prisons, they started lobbying for longer terms, for 3 strikes and you get a life prison, so they had lifelong customers. That's 1/3 of the black population. Oh, it's true, you get a lifelong customer whenever you send them to prison for life. That's what they advocated for. Those people are now out, they don't get paid, they drag down wages for everybody. The other problem, social dimension in the United States, is we have an immigration problem. You got 11.5 million people that are undocumented in the United States that are working. They have no rights. Every time they try to point out a safety violation, they get sent back or deported or fired. They have no rights. They drive down the wages for everyone. So those social problems can be regulated, can be fixed by the federal government that can help raise wages for everyone and thus increase demand for everyone on the consumer side. And if you look at countries, the U.S. is a classic example of not investing enough. They're afraid to invest because there isn't the consumer demand. Wages have been stagnant. They invest in hedge funds that buy other companies and don't really have real investment in anything. Some of the countries in Europe they're lacking the public investment that's needed to stimulate and create the demand and the confidence of consumers so that private investment can then kick in and augment that public investment that's being made. Once you start pulling back on the public side, private side pulls back as well.
Should we turn our attention to Turkey and where you're seeing your investment? You talked about education being where you're now seeing education moving to. I mean, you're seeing investment moving to. Is that the priority for you at the moment? And how are you enticing that?
You know, definitely it's the one of the priorities of the government because especially after the election of the existing Prime Minister, Mr. Davutoğlu also announced a new reform program, especially based on 25 main titles, and majority of them related to somehow to education, and of course about the R&D investments, also some other dimensions which can actually stimulate the how can I say the entrepreneurship at the same time, also the increase the demand problem, decrease the problem actually on the other side.
Have you looked at the social side of things when we're about to debate sort of the nature of impact bonds? Have you been looking at the social side and innovative ways of investing in the greener side and in the inclusive side of investment for Turkey?
Actually, when we look at the 2 dimensions, especially we talked about on the SME level, there has been many steps taken, but on the social side, we must say, and the more innovative side, I can maybe I'm not the one to maybe to elaborate on the the topic in a better way, because maybe I can talk about the reforms has been taken so far, and if we look at that, especially we are trying to increase the capacity of the new rising maybe middle class of Turkey. Actually represents the main economic driving force of the country, especially if we look at the last 10 years, 12 years, and you can see that the parties who are representing their demands are getting the more votes in Turkey now, and now they are driving the Turkish economy more and more, and this is why I think especially the capacities for these small businesses and small and middle enterprises are trying to be, increased by the government by different measures. And I think, but on the social side, I must say, it's better to, leave maybe the floor to Mr. Cohen to talk about that.
I mean, just as a quick aside, of course, you're about to have an election coming up in Turkey. Do you find political uncertainty affects your job in terms of bringing in investment?
For foreign direct investments, political stability is always one of the most important, of course, indicators. For our case, especially, if you look at the greenfield investments, which are looking to a country for 30 years, 40 years, maybe at the end they look at the potential of the country with the dynamics, the geostrategic location, and what the potential of country for the future. But of course, the existing situation for the political stability is also important, and maybe at least with regard to taking decisions, they are waiting for the results of the election. This is usually the case, and after the election time, you usually see a kind of a comeback for the investors, especially towards the ends of the year. So this is the case at the moment for Turkey too. But if you, depending on our experience with the investors, rather than some temporary issues, they are looking at the potentials, as I said, the geostrategic location, especially for Turkey, the population, for example, the average age, which is 30 for Turkey, which is less than especially the European average, which makes Turkey an attractive destination, especially for European investors. But the political uncertainty is always a risk. And if you consider Turkey, the regional situation is also important too, because if you look at our neighborhood, the situation is not very well with regard to political certainty. But we believe that after some signs of solution start to come from the different countries of the region, the opportunities will multiply, not only for Turkey, but for the whole region and globally for the whole world, I think.
Ronald Cohen, let's look at answers, and let's look at social answers. Who is the most excited and demanding to start putting money to work in impact investing?
So the OECD has written an excellent report on impact investing, which I would encourage you all to read. Social issues are a huge burden on governments, and governments can no longer afford to deal with them, and they realize that they're not most effective at dealing with them. If you look at dropout rates in Africa of 25% from primary school, the opportunity to keep kids in school, the prevention of people dropping out, is a lot more valuable than trying to remedy the problem of the unemployed, unskilled, in Africa subsequently. The same applies for a host of social issues. Those who are passionate about this are, first of all, the millennial generation. The millennial generation is looking for meaning in its activity. We should ask the question of the audience, do they feel that the millennial generation wants to do more than just make money? That there is a new force here that is looking for purpose as well as money?
Let's ask them quickly. We've got another poll. Audience, would you invest in an impact bond? Would you invest in a social investment where your returns were not just financial, but also in terms of actually doing good, for want of a better word? Let's have a look at, we'll leave them to vote. Please do get doing that via your phones, but do carry on in the meantime.
So as a millennial generation, investors have signed up to the tune of $46 trillion to the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment. So investors are looking for a financial return, but also for a social return, which includes environmental. The big breakthrough of our generation has come from the fact that we are measuring impact accurately. We used to think, as philanthropists, as governments, that you couldn't measure anything in the social area. But you can measure an improvement in the dropout rate from school, in reoffending and going back to prison, in the number of homeless people in the street. You can measure the number of kids from poor backgrounds who make it through to college. You can measure in many, many areas a social performance. When you tie it to a financial performance, You give social entrepreneurs, whether they be in not-for-profits or for-profit with purpose entrepreneurs, the key to the capital markets. And in my view, in addition to all of the things that we have said today, we need to change our mindset, to think outside of the box. If we don't improve the state of our society and we expect governments to continue to pay for problems that they can't solve, it's going to be very difficult to get back to thriving economies.
We'll wait to see the responses to that poll, but I first of all want to ask Thierry de Longma, Vice President of Finance and Risk Management at Asia Development Bank, to say a few words just in response to what's been brought up by the panel thus far, and then we'll be throwing out questions to the audience. But of course, I think we've really debated so far as to what the key problems are, where we're starting to see signs of life, whether regulation indeed can help, and indeed how we can think outside the box, as Sir Ronald Cohen says. But please, Thierry.
Thank you. Thank you, Caroline, for asking the question. I'd like to move east, leave OECD and go to Asia. Asia, where 4 billion people live, 60% of the world population, and where we still have, despite growth rates of about 6% per year, 1.7 billion people living with less than $2 per day. I'd like to make some observation and ask a question to the panelists. The observation is about infrastructure development. Why is it important? How high is the demand? And how can we meet the demand? It is important because it is the main channel, main way to promote economic growth and also reduce poverty. The demand is huge. We estimate at the Asian Development Bank that the demand in Asia and the Pacific is $750 billion per year. How do we meet it? There are traditional ways, but I'd like to take on the observation by Ronald Cohen that public cannot do everything. And indeed, we are trying to bring in the private sector. There are three ideas that I'd like to throw to the attention of the panelists. Private-public partnership, PPPs. Very unsuccessful so far in Asia, maybe more in Europe. I'd like to know their thoughts about PPPs. Second, development of capital markets. We've talked about regulations in markets which are developed. My point here is their thoughts on the need to develop a capital market, which are in most Asian countries underdeveloped. And finally, innovative solutions. In Asia, we have estimated that there are $6 trillion of savings, $3.5 trillion in pension funds, and several hundreds of billions of remittances. So the idea is how to tap those untapped resources to bring them, some of them, in the infrastructure financing space, maybe through the introduction of project bonds. Some have been done in Europe, none have been done in Asia. I'd like to have the thought of the panel on that. And also green bonds. I also draw on the observation, the point made by Ronald Cohen on social investments. We, the Asian development banks, have issued green bonds, and interestingly, we were able to attract new sets of investors, particularly from the United States, who did invest in green bonds because they were green, while they did not invest in our traditional bonds because they didn't have the green label. So I believe that maybe this is a way to maybe unlock some investment in the infrastructure space. Thank you.
Let's talk about PPPs, public-private partnerships, perhaps with Turkey's appetite for it at the moment. I mean, Mr. Koç, are you finding that this is something that's becoming attractive in terms of financing within Turkey for your infrastructure?
In Turkey, we start to use PPP projects since early 1980s. Even sometimes we think that we are the developer of such a system. During those days, we called that system as build, operate, and transfer, or build, operate. Since then, we heavily used that system, these PPP projects. Still nowadays in Turkey, there are big tunnel projects, even third airport project. very big health and hospital projects. They are under construction and still financed by a kind of PPP projects. This is very important because if there is a demand problem from the households in the economies, so the governments or municipalities should take an active role to create demand. So this investment, PPP or big infrastructure investments, they create extra demand. But not only this, maybe more importantly, it increases the confidence for the future among the people. They believe in the future. They believe that the future will be better than today. And this is the reason I think that this PPP project is very crucial. And maybe in Asia, maybe it is not so successful. But in Turkish example, there are very good successful example, as I mentioned, since early 1980s.
I mean, let us look at some of the questions that have also been fielded from the audience, because I know there are some that have been sent to this particular direction. And there's one particular one. Regulation is usually introduced to address misconduct. What is the finance sector doing to re-establish trust? Danielle Nui, what do you think at the moment the banking sector is doing, those that you oversee, that you supervise? Are they acting in a way that you want to see to reinstall trust?
Well, the governance on the risk culture, the conduct culture is definitely changing after the crisis. And we are making sure as regulators and supervisors that this is keeping the needed momentum that was absolutely needed. It may take time to re-establish trust. Trust is something very precious, and you have to preserve it when it is. It takes some time, but I think the banks are doing their best for the time being.
Can you give us a sense of timing in terms of, we've sort of articulated potentially that these regulatory changes take time, the banking union takes time, and actually maybe we're all being a little bit too demanding of wanting to see investment being helped to a certain extent by the banks immediately. Can you give us a sense of when investment will pick up, you think, in terms of lending from the financial sector in the Eurozone? Will we get to pre-crisis levels next year, the year after?
Well, indeed, in the paper that was circulated for this panel, there was mention of the fact that, for example, the ultra-low interest rates on impact of regulation have been disappointing. I don't think it has been, as a matter of fact. It takes time, as you say, to get on track. And we can see right now the fact that this policy has been driving a sharp reduction of banks' funding costs, which are now stabilized close to historically low levels. And those improved conditions have translated into lower lending rates to firms and households. And this is particularly visible in the so-called composite lending rate to firms, an index that is used to measure this situation, which has declined by 60 basis points between end of May 2014 and end of March 2015. In turn, thanks to this situation, lending rates are contributing to stimulate credit growth and support consumption on investment. And we can see that the risk aversion that is normal after a crisis, and that was mentioned by certain speakers before, is going down, really. It has been strong in the aftermath of the crisis, but now we can see that the banks are much more oriented towards lending. We are, of course, as supervisors, monitoring closely these developments because on the one hand, that's a positive news. It's a signal of the recovery in the European economy. But on the other hand, we want to make sure that it's not the signal that there is a risk of asset price bubble somewhere, and that banks are not taking excessive risk, because that would be the starting of new vulnerabilities. And what the economy needs, the funding of the economy needs, is stable providing funding of the economies.
Is there a question in the audience? I'm very sad to say that we're about to run out of time, but yes, we immediately have hands up over here. Is there a roving microphone? Perfect. Please introduce yourself and then your question.
Okay. It doesn't work.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, sorry. Christian Verbic from Slovenia, presenting here also the positions of European Federation of Investors and Financial Services Users. So regarding the trust and the confidence in the market and investment, especially in Europe, because the individual investors should be the ones who should be more present in the market with their savings, and also with the maybe new reform of the savings and pension funds on the one side, and on the other side, let's say the position that was just mentioned from the Central Bank of Europe. I believe that expropriation of the not just share owners, but also the bond owners is something that it's against the confidence and the belief in the market and investment race. So on the other side, I would just like to ask the highest representative of the European Central Bank, what did they do with the stress test? Because they had not have equal standards and frames and basis for all the countries in EU, or for all the banks and all the systems. So this is something that is against trust and belief in the market and the equal positions, especially for the individual investors. That should be, also Jean-Claude Juncker said, the individual investors should be the ones that are in the center, in the focus of the financing the SMEs, especially in the European economy. Thank you very much for your answer.
I think that might have been directed at you, Ms. Noy.
Well, this is about what we call in our jargon bailing, meaning that the creditors of the banks have to pay for the failures of the banks. Well, this is what creditors of corporates have been doing forever. When the corporate is having difficulties, the investors are not fully paid. Before that, there was what was called bailout, meaning that the governments, the taxpayer money was supporting the banks on paying for the failures. It's very simple. Now the taxpayer money, the governments cannot afford to pay for the failures of the banks. So there is a need for the creditors to analyze the risk they are taking when they invest in corporates or in banks, and to accept that if they make wrong investments, they will have to pay for the choices that they have been made. And this is coming again very gradually too. We have a new directive on recovery and resolution, which is partly implemented this year, partly implemented next year. There will be a single resolution mechanism for the euro area and a single resolution fund. This is coming gradually. But I think we have no choice. The governments cannot afford to have the crisis that we have had, because for some of them, the reason was they supported their banks.
Richard Trumka,
Carolyn, the question was what can be done to establish trust? And one thing I would like to suggest is that we have a single international standard for different items. And let me give you a classic example. In the United States, the Federal Reserve is required to stress test the big banks on a quarterly basis. When they applied American standards, we got a capital ratio of about 11.25%. When they applied European standards, these are to derivatives because of derivatives, they get a capital ratio of about 4.75%. So applying the two different standards gives you a completely different picture of whether those banks are properly capitalized or not capitalized. And that causes significant distrust by international investors. So if we had a standard that everybody had to comply with, investors at least could know or have a confidence that that standard is being applied equally to them.
Is there one more question for the audience?
Hello, Karen Wilson with the OECD. There's been a lot of talk about SME and SME financing and bank financing, but actually the majority of SMEs are not interested in growth. They play a very important role in the economy, but they're not the ones driving growth and jobs. It's a small subset of high growth firms. And those firms need a very different kind of financing than bank financing. They need equity and other forms of capital. So could the panel talk a bit about other types of financing that are needed for these high growth firms and also for these social ventures to grow as well?
Let's ask our venture capitalist expert on the, Ronald Cohen.
There's no shortage today of people who feel that in certain areas of the world we failed to get venture capital really to take off. The United States is full of venture capital today for technology. It's almost back to the peak before the 2000, don't want to call it a bubble publicly, but it certainly was a bubble then. Hopefully it won't be a bubble now. But entrepreneurship requires equity, as our speaker just said. And in places like developing countries, there's a huge shortage of equity risk capital. Now, impact investment is actually the way to supply that, because with impact investment, as we heard, a new category of investor comes in that wants measurable financial and social returns. So if you're bringing people who are unemployed into employment by investing in companies located in poor areas of developed countries or in poor countries, in emerging countries, you are getting measurable financial and social returns at the same time. And we're beginning to see governments focus on how you move the needle on social issues. So if you want to move the needle on dropout rates in education in Africa, you're not going to do it through another $1 billion of aid. If you want to try and bring investment to poor areas, you're not going to do it by just providing incentives. You're going to need to encourage the setting up of investment firms that are focused on investing in those areas. That's where profit with purpose comes in, and that's where the funding of not-for-profits come in. Now, when I speak, I have the feeling that a lot of you will feel, well, this is marginal to the system. And I want to say that if we look ahead 20 to 30 years, we're going to see impact public equities, impact fixed income, impact venture capital, impact private equity, impact property.
Let's just see how much you've whetted the audience's appetite when it comes to impact bond investing, because I think we've got the response to our poll, and can we see as to whether how many would indeed invest in social impact bonds? I think we can bring up the results now. Well, a resounding yes. So already you seem to be driving the thirst for it already, Sir Ronald Cohen. But Eric, I wanted to ask you, how much of the 300 billion euros in terms of investment that we are yet to see back from pre-crisis levels, how much of that do you think venture capital can add? How much do you think that it would come from lending to startups?
I think, as I mentioned, it's a mix of the different elements, because if you think about what is going to get us there, it's really a question of confidence, a question of incentive, a question of economic dynamic. If you think about innovation, if you think about regulation of markets to increase competition and increase investment, this is going to be across the board. We are going to have, major firm taking some of their 800 billion and putting that at work. We're also going to see a lot of the attackers. As mentioned, a lot of the jobs are from the high growth companies attacking, for example, in digital. So when you see that, it's a mix. The question is, do you get the right market dynamic to get the actors to basically invest along the chain, from the attackers to the defenders? If I just zoom on digital right now, everybody is working on that. You have a lot of attackers, a lot of venture capital flowing into e-commerce, and you have some countries like the UK have 10% already of the GDP in digital. Some other countries have only 3 or 4. And it's a mix of venture capital supporting the attackers, but also some of the defenders adapting themselves to, in fact, be better than the attackers. And so the question is really going to be around the market dynamic to ensure all the actors draw on the different financing and basically get some investment at work.
Do we have one more question from the audience? We have a number of... Yes, there's a lady down here at the front. There were 2 hands up in the middle.
Thank you. It is very interesting to hear from all of you. And Indonesia, I'm from Indonesia, Nurhayati alias Gaf, as an MP. It's interesting when Indonesia has an experience with the economic crisis on 1998. And at this time that who really do the SME is women at that time, because a lot of men are laid off from the job, and the women are starting doing economic empowerment. And when the countries goes up, then as usual that we do not have a special access for the woman. So my question, I didn't hear from you that when we talk about the social impact bond, do you really think that as a bankers or as a consultant or whatever, that to give a special woman, bond for the woman, because the access to financial for women are very difficult, especially when they're depending on the man as a husband, or still the banking institution have that regulation more for men than for the woman. Thank you.
I'll let you answer that, Sir Ronald.
Yep. I think women are a very important target of social impact bond and development impact bonds. And there are several examples that are being prepared now to bring women into areas where women traditionally had a big role, like agriculture in many countries, but also into to bring women graduates into technology sectors of the economy and so on. It's interesting that the first development impact bond, which wasn't in a developed country, therefore, was in Rajasthan to reduce the dropout rate among girls at primary school, because it all starts with women. And if girls drop out and don't have an education, the likelihood that their children, their husbands, and so on will be the same is obviously extremely high. And when we begin to think of moving the needle on literacy in Africa, you have to take into account the literacy of mothers. Now you could have, and I have a mechanism, but we don't have time to go through it today, for providing $1 billion of outcomes funding to bring people up in terms of their literacy. Now you could focus a development impact bond of $1 billion. You could raise $1 billion to improve the literacy of women in a particular country or in a particular region. The big advantage you have in doing it that way is that the funds deploying these bonds are looking for entrepreneurs on the ground who believe that they can deliver an improvement that is sufficient for their investors to get paid 7 or 8% on the social impact bond. But we're very interested in finding organizations across all the countries represented here, which is probably most of the world, where you believe there is the opportunity to help women to achieve social improvement of one kind or another. Microfinance was a very important first step in providing self-employment, but there are many other issues that microfinance cannot solve, and education is one of the key ones, The United Nations is resetting its Millennium Goals into its new sustainability goals. There should be an important focus on women, and I believe that you'll move the needle by having a significant effort through development impact bonds.
Yes, another question just here.
Yes, mine.
I think it was working.
It is? Okay. My name is Jörgen Andersson. I'm from Sweden. Angel Gurria was talking about a new economy in his speech. Investments must, in the end, have the objective to create jobs. But what does the new economy mean for jobs? I'll give you an example. The Swedish car manufacturer Volvo was sold and had about 20,000 workers. Mojang, another Swedish company, was sold to the same amount and had 40 people working. So what does the new economy mean in investments and creating jobs?
Richard Trumka, is that something that you put your mind to, as of course in the labour movement? Do you see about, it's talking about really the disruption of labour and indeed the digitalisation?
Yeah, we think about that every single day. Look, the economy is transitioning, and transition can create jobs or not create jobs. Right now, everybody, including the OECD, will throw GDP around like it's a measure of something. To average working people, GDP doesn't mean anything. Because if GDP goes up and my wages stay flat, I don't care. If GDP goes up and I was laid off, I don't care. So we're starting to look at new measures and new ways to create jobs. The point is, and I'll go back to my earlier point, governments have a role to play in investment. They have to admit that austerity was a failure, start investing into the infrastructure that is large, creating jobs, that makes the country far more efficient, far more capable of competing in a world economy. Start looking at different forms of skills training and education along the way. In the United States, this is a best known secret there is, other than the military, the U.S. labor movement skill trains more people every year than any other institution out there through our apprenticeship programs and keep their skills high and keep them moving. It is all about job creation. And when we only think about GDP or the amount of profit and not what goes into it, then the country starts to get left behind. Look, we have 78 million people right now out of work worldwide, growing. So that means we have a 78 million job shortage worldwide to be able to put people to work so that resources aren't lost, that we aren't squandering those people's resources. We can create those jobs, and we can do it in a sustainable way, consistent with a green, clean environment, and handle some of the social problems that we've been talking about with a partnership with government helping and creating a framework and private people filling in. One last thing that I'll talk to you about. The AFL-CIO has 3 different funds. We have a building investment trust fund where we use our money and leverage it to create commercial buildings. We have a housing investment trust where we use our pension funds and we leverage it to create low and moderate income housing. In the process of doing that, we bring people out of the community, minorities out of the community. We train them and give them a career. We get a great return for our pensions, and we fix a social problem, low and moderate income housing, while we're creating millions of hours of work for our members. So it's that type of a partnership that we really have to engage in, and we have to look at people as an asset to be invested in, not a cost to be cut, and that's the difference in philosophy that we need to convert to.
Eric, you had a point to make.
I wanted just to add maybe a couple of elements to this question, because it's obviously a fundamental debate right now in terms of, is growth creating jobs or not? And some of the two trends right now that are accelerating the shift have been obviously globalization, but also technology. Technology with digital, with genomics, with energy transformation, and so on. And what we see behind that right now is that some of the acceleration of the transformation of the jobs. The one you mentioned, like industry, have been basically disappearing over the past 10 years, mainly through robotics. A lot of people thought it was, moving to the east. Yeah, maybe 20% of the jobs of industry moved to the east in Europe, but 80% were destroyed because of robotics, of technology. And so the question here is, how do we accelerate the redeployment to new categories? Technology creates jobs also. When you look at data scientists right now, we are lacking a lot of the data scientists to understand better what to do with big data, how to use that in marketing and so on. At the same time, I was talking about the silver economy before, a lot of opportunities to create jobs in services. And so the question is really, how do we adapt both the regulation but also the education? One of the, we did some work on France. If we don't adapt the education to get the new skills out of the education system, you could get 700,000 jobs not created in 2020, in 5 years, just because the education system is not adapting quickly enough to the new economy, to the new technology. So for me, the two elements would be on one side, education, quick adaptation, and second, obviously, labor market flexibility to reallocate from the old sectors, let's say, to the new sectors. That we at least two ways to try to solve the question you posed.
We've been talking about novel and innovative ways of unleashing investment from a social impact perspective, but also there, of course, is new ways of investing and bringing money to SMEs, to startups, and crowdfunding is one of them. Peer-to-peer lending is another. Can I ask the banker and the banking supervisor, is this something you're putting your mind to now in terms of perhaps some of the competition that is building to lending institutions via peer-to-peer lenders, via crowdfunding? Is it something that you're aware of at Ishbank?
Yes, somebody asked that about the value of the equity finance for SMEs, which is really true. So, when I mentioned this this market-based finance, it includes mainly this equity finance. On the equity finance side, there are some specific areas. Some panelists mentioned that venture capital, private equity, crowdfunding, as you mentioned, angel investment. And what we believe that these areas should be specifically encouraged by the governments. In Turkey, we have those kind of system I would like to mention. For example, if you set up a venture capital fund, it is exempted, all the revenues, exempted from capital gain tax or corporate tax. And we have a licensed angel investor system. If you like to be angel investors, you should get a license from the government. If you have that license, again, your investments in those as equity investment in those kind of companies, it is exempted from the tax. And more recently, we have created a unique system. I think I have never seen that system in another country. As a company, if you increase your capital and you bring fresh capital into your company, this new capital is tax deductible. You can deduct the cost of capital from the tax. All these are the aim of all these regulations to increase the new equity finance in the system.
And you're pro it, therefore?
Yeah.
And what about from a regulatory perspective, from an oversight perspective? Is it an area that you're keeping a keen eye on?
Yes, for sure. As I said before, 80% of the economy funding is coming through the banks, so it's probably too much. It's good if other sources of funding are taking over as well. And when we can do something to help, like with securitization, the credit market union that the co-legislators and ECB are promoting, this is certainly something that we are trying to do. You mentioned crowdfunding. There are many diverse sources of funding. I would say the only limit on the caution that has to be put there is consumer protection. Are the people investing in crowdfunding fully aware of what they are investing in and what kind of return they can expect? That's something that has to be addressed, but provided it is addressed, there is no problem.
I think that's quite interesting, the consumer protection and indeed the perhaps hunger for yield and what that might respond. There's a question that's been put forward via Wisembly, and perhaps one that, Sir Ronald, you can look at, because it says, are short-term returns expectations from investors a break to social impact investing? Is that a concern, or could people become a little bit too jubilant about the 7 to 9% that you're offering?
The typical life of a social impact bond is 5 to 10 years today. So you're talking something that is closer to venture capital and private equity, much closer than investing in public markets. But if we want to try to get to critical mass and get significant amounts of capital flowing, we do need the partnership of government. But it is an enabling role that is required. We're not asking government for money as such. But if we take unclaimed assets from banks, these are accounts that have been separated from their owners for 10 or 15 years or more. In the UK, £700 million has been taken by the government to devote on social issues. Japan has legislation coming up. It's about $800 million in unclaimed bank assets. If we create with that wholesalers of impact investment capital, funding new investment managers who are aiming to deliver both financial and social returns, including environmental within social. And then if government begins to advertise the cost of social issues, you can go on the web, Cabinet Office, and you can look at the cost of 640 social issues in the UK and provide incentives for individuals through crowdfunding or through funds to put money up on a long-term basis. None of this is short-term. But the people investing are investing because they want a social return. They want to improve other people's lives. I think that is a change from the previous generation. And if governments take advantage of it, it's going to be a way of creating innovation that enables government not to step away, because government is paying. I'm talking about outcomes funds. If £1 billion outcomes fund is creating in the UK, government will create it to pay out on successful social impact bonds. Government isn't stepping back. Government is harnessing entrepreneurship and innovation to set new ways of dealing with social issues, new benchmarks for the delivery of social services. Ministers in the UK see this as a way of improving the delivery of social services. And so it's not about cutting back government's role. It's about saying taking risk and innovating in tackling social issues is not what governments do best. Entrepreneurs do that best.
Very sadly, our time is running out. Let's have one more question from the audience. Please, sir.
My name is... Hello? Hello? My name is Chris Coles, the Capital Spillway Trust. Your core problem is you do not have any structure whatever to deliver equity capital on free enterprise terms to new job creators. It's been a core problem for decades. It's something I've addressed personally now for more than 2 decades. And I'm doing my best to promote this as a talking point. The OECD last September added the Capital Spillway Trust to their new network on institutional investors and long-term investment. And I'm here during the 2 days. If anybody wants to talk to me about what I'm doing, I'll be very pleased to talk about it. But your core problem is you have no structure, no set of agreed rules, no mechanisms, no institutions, none whatever, that will deliver free enterprise equity capital to a new job creator. And your problem with banking is you're trying, lots of people all over the planet are trying to create little businesses, but they're grossly undercapitalized and the banks are unable to deal with them in the new regulatory framework, which is perfectly properly placed. You need equity capital investment right down at the grassroots to create a seedbed of millions of little companies starting up. Thank you.
So is there an answer to that? Is there something that could be formulated to help alleviate this said problem? Would anyone on the...
Personally, I work as general manager of a venture capital company in Turkey. Venture capital or private equity. In a way, we invested equity in small and medium-sized companies. I know that some other equity investors, private equity or venture capital, they have some principles. I don't think that job creation is one of the principles when they selecting the companies to invest. You're right. The most important thing is profit and growth. And as you're right, this is not a principle. You're right.
Now, very sadly, I think it's probably 1 minute left. So I wanted to just put a question. It can only be a 1 or maximum 2-word answer to each of you. But if we were debating the way to unlock investment, if you give me one optimistic view of what in a word or a sentence you feel could help promote investment as we see it, what is your main priority? We start with Richard Trumka and move it down. What is your one key priority when it comes to helping unlock investment? Is it less regulation, more regulation, tailored regulation? Is it the help of the government? Give us your...
Public investment in public goods and infrastructure. That'll unlock and set the groundwork for private investment to follow in behind it. And look, I just want to add one thing to that. The brother that asked about the jobs, a fundamental question that we never ask is, and none of us have talked about it here, is, does the economy exist to meet the needs of people, or do people exist to meet the needs of the market? And we need to think about that a little bit more than what we have in the past.
Ada Emmet.
Maybe parallel to that also, maybe public investment, especially in a sophisticated way, especially in areas like education, green energy, and innovation, and also decreasing costs for that, especially, and make life easier for small businesses to invest in these areas, maybe by some innovative measures that has been told today or that we didn't have enough time to talk about. But at the end, from both sides of the problem, as I told before, for the big aggregate demand, especially increasing the investments by stimulating them through government measures. So at least some extent of regulation seems to be needed still. And also, as I said before, from the downside, especially for the small business SMEs and for the new investments, social investments, at least, maybe not directly, but passively making life easier for them by decreasing costs. And this is also something that government can make great contribution, I think.
So in one word, your priority, one word?
One word for me.
Priority?
Of course, for more foreign direct investments for me, of course, for my balance sheet. But at the end, I can say, I think, maybe in line with that, also more public expenditures also.
Public expenditure. Daniel Nguyen?
More integration in Europe, starting within banking union. Thanks to the banking union, there is less ring-fencing of capital on funding, liquidity, which is helping for the funding of the economy. And we should go beyond the banking union and develop a capital market union.
Integration. For you?
I have two conclusions. One, if there is no demand in the economy, so the governments and municipalities should take an active role, and especially just developing some infrastructure projects. And secondly, as I mentioned before, the policymakers should encourage market-based finance in order to support SMEs and young startups companies.
Someone can
measure impact. As you measure impact through entrepreneurs, big companies, and investors, you bring the invisible heart of markets to guide their invisible hand.
Impact. And Eric Lebay?
I would in fact, whatever measure is taken is always a mix of supply and demand. So it's really improving competitiveness, at the same time stimulating the demand. And this can be done in package deals, like, I don't know, on the energy market, you can at the same time, you know, get more competitiveness, but also increase the demand. So this approach of package deals on the two elements to get moving. And so this requires trust and integration, but that would be the idea.
Demand and supply.
Yeah, at the same time.
Well, it's been wonderful having such a stellar lineup on the panel. You've all had such very differing but very interesting and fascinating views. It's been constant dialogue. It's been wonderful to get so much audience participation. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a wonderful pleasure to be here from representing Bloomberg Television. So thank you very much indeed. I really want everyone to just give a round of applause to our panelists. It was Richard Schrimke, Ada Emmert, Danya Nui, Eric Lebay, Ihami Koch, and of course Ronald Cohen. Thank you very much indeed.